So a very good morning, dear respected teacher and dear beloved community. How's everybody doing? Some of us are doing well, and some of us, seems this side of the room might not have slept as well as the other side. Let's, for this side of the room, we can send some loving kindness to those friends on this side of the room for the rest of the day. I hope you enjoy the slideshow we have for this morning. I thought I'll do something that I don't normally do and go a little bit high-tech to make it easy for the translators. But as things usually work out, it turned out that it didn't work. And so then I thought, that's okay, I'll write it on the whiteboard. So I went out to the whiteboard, but the whiteboard's completely covered with different posters and announcements. So we will do it just as was done a few centuries ago. And we can always bear in mind that there are a few Dharma teachers in this room, and sometimes we think we've given a wonderful talk. And about 6 months ago, I thought I gave a really great talk on a Sunday. I thought, wow, the ancestors really are doing a good job today. And then the next time I gave a talk, which was 2 weeks later, I happened to ask friends, what did I speak about 2 weeks ago? This is a continuation of that talk. Nobody could remember. So this is something that I think all Dharma teachers need to do. The Buddha didn't have PowerPoint. The Buddha didn't even have a whiteboard or a blackboard. But 2,600 years later, people that were there passed on those stories of what the Buddha shared and the experience of being there. So this is what we are called to do in each and every moment, because the real Dharma is not Dharma given by somebody sitting here, but the Dharma is in each and every moment of our life. This morning we had the opportunity to have a beautiful chanting session, and we began with the sutra opening verse. And for me, sometimes that's enough, that sutra opening verse. It's actually, if we don't know the history of Buddhism, we think, oh, that's a nice verse that was made up in Plum Village. The Dharma is deep and lovely. We now have a chance to see it, to hear it, to study and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning, but it's 1,000 years old, that verse. And in that verse, often it's enough for me to reflect on now in this very moment, not while somebody's giving a talk, but as I'm eating my lunch, as I'm taking a step, as I'm sharing with another person, I now have a chance to see the Dharma. What does it mean to see the Dharma? We're quite used to thinking about the Dharma in terms of hearing it. We think about the Dharma in terms of studying it. We now have a chance to see the Dharma. We now have a chance to study the Dharma, to always learn more, to keep growing. And we have a chance to realize its true meaning. Dharma, in its original sense, was not a set of teachings. We've turned Dharma from its original sense into a set of dogmas, a set of lists that we need to memorize and try to fit ourselves into. But Dharma in its original sense means the way that we engage with each and every moment of our life, the way that we show up for each and every moment of our life. And so I was reflecting on that this morning, that even something as simple as the sutra opening verse, we now have a chance to see the Dharma. What Dharma am I seeing in this moment? What Dharma am I hearing in this moment? What Dharma am I receiving and putting into practice? This last phrase of the sutra opening verse that many of us recite quite quickly, but it's a really important one. As we'll discover today, when we see the Dharma, when we encounter the Dharma, we're also invited to apply it to our daily life, that this is where the transformation happens. I wanted to talk today about two to continue our looking into two very important teachings of the Buddha as we come to the close of the year. One is a continuation of a talk that I gave a few weeks ago, and it's on the simile of the saw, which is in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Trung Aham, number 21, the middle length sayings, number 21. And I really recommend that if you have time, that you read this sutra in its entirety. It's a pivotal teaching of the Buddha. And the other text that we'll be looking at today is a text called the 10 Reflections that the Buddha recommends for practitioners to reflect on every single day. It's from my old favorite, the Anguttara Nikaya, the numbered sayings of the Buddha. This season is a season where, as we come to the close of the year, we reflect on all of the occurrences of this year, and we also have a time where we reflect on forgiveness. There's that joke that I love so much. It says that this is the season for forgiveness, that we should be extending forgiveness to anybody. So if any of you want to come and apologize to me for all the mistakes you've made this past year, I'm willing to forgive you. This is not really the approach of this season. Sometimes people ask, why is it in Buddhism we don't actually talk about forgiveness? For those of us who are students of the texts, you know, there's not actually a sutra or a text that talks explicitly about forgiveness. It's quite different from our usual way of thinking, especially if we've grown up in the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions. There's a lot of talk about forgiveness. Sometimes people can think this is a bit of an oversight. Why does Buddhism talk about compassion and peace and joy, but not about forgiveness? Well, actually in Buddhism, if we cultivate the quality of loving kindness, if we cultivate the quality of compassion, then we don't see that there is another. There's a they, whether that they is a person or a group of people or a nation that we need to forgive. We see that we're connected deeply. Our happiness, our sadness, our situation is not separate from that person. In the time of the Buddha, there was one person, actually there were quite a few actually in the text, but we'll speak about one, who was a thorn in the Buddha's side, the Buddha's cousin. I saw so many articles and postings from people that were giving tips on how to survive being with family through the holidays. So it's a little bit like that. The person who was the real thorn in the Buddha's side was the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta. So whatever the Buddha would recommend, Devadatta would very quickly recommend the exact opposite. And really created a lot of difficulties in the Sangha in the Buddha's time, and even at one point tried to have the Buddha killed. And in the Lotus Sutra, there's a beautiful section. It's a chapter on Devadatta. This person who, from our way of looking, we would consider to be the Buddha's enemy, the one that the Buddha had to forgive. And in the Lotus Sutra, somebody asks the Buddha that question. You know, Devadatta is doing so many horrible things. Why don't you forgive him? And the Buddha said, I've got nothing but gratitude for Devadatta. I've got nothing but gratitude for Devadatta. He's taught me so much. He's the greatest teacher I've ever had. This is in the Lotus Sutra. We don't normally think of these difficult people or these difficult circumstances as our greatest teachers. We tend to think of our greatest teachers as those that we come to and who tell us things that make us feel comfortable and confirm what we already know. That was a fantastic teaching. He confirmed everything that I thought. That's a great teaching. But somebody who challenges us, somebody who says, no, you're wrong, no, that wasn't a good teaching. Or that person is a problem. I don't want to associate with that person. or that group of people think differently to me. So therefore, I just want to be peaceful. In one of the oldest teachings of the Buddha, in the Atthagavagga, the Buddha said, in that way, slowly over time, we lose our direction and our practice becomes all about simply watering what the Buddha calls our entrenchments, building up the fortifications around our very highly built and quite sophisticated walls. In Plum Village, we tend to call these things our habit energies. So a great teacher, whether it's a person or a situation or a group of people, is something that calls us forth, that helps us to expand our circle just a little bit, to understand things a little bit more deeply. So the first teaching that I'd like to talk about today, which is the sutra that I began just mentioning a couple of weeks ago, is called the Simile of the Saw, and it's a very well-known teaching in the Buddhist tradition. It's in a collection of discourses called the Middle Length Sayings. It's actually quite a long teaching, and I've just taken a few excerpts from it, some of the key points for this talk today. But I really encourage you to read it in its entirety, not only once but many times. It begins with the phrase, "Thus have I heard." And maybe I'm just a little bit weird, but I also sometimes just stop there, because that's also a very important phrase. Thus have I heard. Evang me suttam in Pali. Most of the sutras begin with that phrase. And it's put there because the Venerable Ananda, who was the Buddha's attendant for a number of years, had an eidetic memory, a photographic memory. And so when they had the first council, actually the senior monks and nuns couldn't agree on what the Buddha actually taught. Everybody heard different things. So they had to ask Ananda, who had a kind of a photographic memory, to recite the teaching. So Ananda would recite, "Thus have I heard. I heard the Buddha say this." And I like this phrase a lot, because for me it's an invitation to us also. Every time we encounter a teaching, we need to ask ourselves, what am I hearing? What am I ready to hear? The sutras that we read in our chanting book, I think I've heard each one of them hundreds of times. And so it's easy to think, oh, I've heard all of this before. I know what the next sentence is. But just as we heard on the first evening, meditation is about learning to listen, to open this space of availability. So we open that space of availability, we touch into where we are, what's going on for us. And then we listen to what stands out for us in this moment. In that way, each time we encounter a teaching, we hear something different. Given the experience of the Buddha's senior disciples, many of whom in that first council had attained fruits of the path already, and yet they all had heard different things. It's always interesting to me to reflect on the fact that the sutras we've received are what Ananda heard. So what was important to Sariputra? What did Sariputra remember? What did the maid who happened to come to hear the Buddha teach that day, the village girl, the queen, and so on, what did they hear? What was important to them? There's that lovely scene, it's maybe not lovely, but it's quite informative in the movie The Life of Brian. Has anybody seen that? Yeah, we've seen it. Where Jesus is on the mountain and he's giving the Beatitudes, and there's this crowd gathered around the mountain. The Bible is like the sutra. It doesn't talk about sound issues. The Buddha didn't have microphones. And yet often in the sutras it says there was 1,250 monastics there, there were so many thousands of other people, there were many bodhisattvas and so on who were gathered, but nobody ever says there was a bit of a sound issue and people couldn't hear. Everyone was able to hear. And the only way they can explain this is through the supernatural power of the Buddha. And in this movie, The Life of Brian, there's a scene where Jesus is giving his equivalent of a Dharma talk, blessed are the peacemakers, and people are straining in the back, and somebody's saying to them, what did he say? And the person said, I think he said, blessed are the cheesemakers, and so on. And it goes on like this, and people are calling out, speak up, speak up. It's very, very funny. So, thus have I heard. And in the text, it says the Buddha was staying in the Jeta Grove in Shravasti, in Anathapindika's monastery. At that time, Venerable Paguna of the Top Knot, was his name. So a lot of the disciples had nicknames, and he was called Venerable Paguna of the Top Knot because he used to, before he became a monk, differently to a lot of the wandering ascetics, would tie his hair up into a bun, kind of like the ancient equivalent of a man bun, on top of his head. So Venerable Paguna of the Top Knot. He was spending too long, mixing too closely with a particular group. He became so attached to this particular group that if anyone so much as criticized them in his presence, he became angry and upset, and he even instigated disciplinary proceedings. So one of the monks saw this, and he went to the Buddha and he shared it with the Buddha and told the Buddha what was going on. And the Buddha said, so tell Venerable Paguna of the Top Knot to come to me. So this monk went to Venerable Paguna and said, the teacher's calling you. You better go and see him. That's always something that as a student, when the attendant of our teacher comes and says, the teacher wants to see you, we kind of have a feeling. So he went to see the Buddha, and the Buddha said to him, is it really true that you've been spending too much time only associating with a particular group, so much so that if anyone criticizes them in your presence, that you react really strongly? Is that how you've become? And Venerable Paguna said, it's true. So we have to admire Venerable Paguna a little bit, because he didn't say, oh, Tay, you didn't get the full story. You don't really understand me. No, that's not really what happened. He just simply said, yes, it's true. And then the Buddha says to him, Paguna, aren't you a person who's gone forth from lay life into homelessness? And then the Venerable Paguna says, it's true, I have. A monastic in Chinese and Vietnamese is traditionally called a left home person. Sujaren or Sukya. Người Sukya means left home. We leave our physical home, we leave our birth name, we leave all of our inheritance, we leave everything behind in order to be at home everywhere. But that's only the surface level. On a deeper level, this term left home person is an invitation for each one of us. If we want to know what our home is, it's not only a physical place, but it's the kind of habit energies, the patterns of thinking, the patterns of behavior that we take refuge in over and over again. Those comfortable, well-worn entrenchments. Those patterns, those pathways that we walk down again and again. And for me, this is one of the hearts of Buddhist practice, for us to recognize what are the places that we call home, this home sweet home of our comfortable habit energies, these patterns of thinking, these patterns of behavior. And once we identify them, to be able to ask ourselves, is this our true home? Or what happens if I play a little bit with this habit energy, that I decide not to walk down that pathway, that I try something different? It's possible for somebody to have physically left home, but still be very much at home in that sense of not looking deeply at our habit energies. It's also possible for somebody to physically be a householder and have left home because they're transforming their habit energies. And so the Paguna says, yes, I've left home. And the Buddha says, in that way, it's not appropriate for you to mix so closely with only one particular small group who you agree with and you find agreeable. This is an important teaching. Not only to be with those who we agree with. The age of social media has done this. The algorithm shows us more and more of what it thinks we like and less of what it thinks we don't like. We never get challenged. Our views just get continually reinforced. So much so that if anyone criticizes you or them in your presence or even attacks you or them, you should train yourself like this. My mind will be unaffected. I will blurt out no bad words, but I'll remain full of compassion with a heart of love flowing like the river Ganges. Isn't that a beautiful expression? Usually when we react, we even feel it in our body, we tense up. This flow is cut off. Flowing like the river Ganges, we become defensive. And no secret hate. No secret hate. This is how you should train. And the next sentence is perhaps a little challenging for us. The Buddha says, so much so that even if someone strikes you or them with fists, stones, rods and swords in your presence, you should recognize and give up any desires or thoughts belonging to those still stuck in the home life. So this is a very interesting teaching. This doesn't mean, of course, that we shouldn't defend ourselves or others against violence, but that even in such circumstances, we shouldn't give way to anger. I once had a senior sister say something to me that I disagreed with for many years. She said, everybody's always doing the best that they can. I thought, how could you say this? Thinking about somebody who's a mass murderer, thinking about all of these other situations in the world. How could she say this? Everyone's always doing the best that they can. And it was only after a lot of deep looking I realized the truth of that statement. If we look deeply, that person, given their upbringing, given the circumstances that they have, given the challenges that they have, they're doing the best that they can in that moment. Doesn't mean they couldn't do better, but they're doing the best that they can. So, in those situations, this teaching here is a reminder for us to recognize, first of all, how we are being affected. What is it watering in me? And rather than just mindlessly reacting, pouring kerosene onto the fire, how is this touching me and why? And then recognizing that, choosing to respond from a different place. Choosing to respond from a different place. Recognizing our motivation. The Buddha here says that we should give up any desires or thoughts belonging to those who are still stuck in the home life. He doesn't say be desireless and don't do anything. The Buddha says give up those desires belonging to those still stuck at home. In the home of habit energies, in the home of reactivity, blind reactivity. Desire in Buddhism has three aspects, two of which are important in this consideration. The first way that desire can manifest in a situation is we react with aversion. Aversion can range from anything from absolute pushing away. I don't want this, anything but this. Anything but you. I don't want you in my life. To a very slight kind of just distaste. And it can also be the other extreme as well, that we want more of. We only want, we get drawn into. Pushing away, pulling towards. These are the two elements of desire. One's called bhava tanha, and the other one's called vibhava tanha. Wanting more of, wanting less of, or wanting to annihilate is the other way to translate. So the Buddha says something that I find interesting here. The Buddha says, I used to be satisfied with the monastics. I used to be happy with the monastics. When I taught them something, I didn't have to keep on instructing them over and over. I just had to prompt their mindfulness. A good teacher, any good teacher, whether it's a person or a situation, awakens the teacher within ourselves. A good teacher is not going to point you again and again to them, but to point you to the wisdom that's within you. The Buddha then offers a simile here that for me I feel is really important and points to one of the major misconceptions about Buddhist practice that we have in the modern world. And this is a retreat in itself, this next paragraph. Perhaps a retreat of 3 months, maybe a lifetime. The Buddha says, suppose that not far from a town or village, there's a large grove of beautiful trees, choked with weeds. Along comes a person who wants to help protect and nurture that grove. They'd clean up the interior of the grove and properly care for the straight, well-formed saplings. In that way, in due course, that grove would grow, increase, and mature. So friends, you too should recognize and give up what's unskillful in you and devote yourselves to cultivating skillful qualities. So there are so many things to consider in this short paragraph. But I'll just draw out a couple of them in this talk today. Note that the Buddha doesn't say a person sees this and goes in and pulls up all the weeds. The Buddha says to go and take care of the interior of the grove. Go and take care of the interior of the grove, to properly care for the well-formed saplings so that they grow, increase, and mature. Many times we approach our practice in a way in which we think, I have to fight my defilements. This is a phrase that we hear in many Buddhist traditions. Fight the defilements. We turn our practice into a war. I have to uproot this, uproot that. This morning we heard in English and Vietnamese a sutra that's very connected to this sutra also, the 5 ways of putting an end to anger. The Buddha goes through 5 different examples, 5 examples of people who have different levels of challenges, or we perceive them to have different levels of challenges. And then we have the 5th example of someone who is fresh and at ease and peaceful, but still we have problems with, with that person. And in each of the cases, the Buddha doesn't say zoom in on the issues that person has and try to help that person uproot those issues. No, the Buddha says focus in on what's nourishing, what's healing, what's life-giving in that person or in that situation. Nurture that. I guess our friends in the Australian Psychological Association would call this cognitive restructuring. Our mind is hardwired to focus on the negative. It's called the Zeigarnik effect, Psychology 101. Our mind is hardwired to focus on what's wrong, what's incomplete, and so on in any situation. It served our ancestors well when they were hunters and gatherers, this psychological adaptation. But in our situation, it can, this tendency can nurture a lot of suffering, focusing always on what's wrong or what's going to go wrong. So the Buddha invites us, rather than focusing on the weeds that are there, to nurture the skillful qualities, the beautiful trees. The Buddha recommends that we recognize within us, not necessarily in other people. That's quite easy to do, to recognize what other people need to transform. If our friends comes to us or our partner comes to us, we can give them a whole list of what they need to transform. But if we reflect on what do we need to transform, the list for our partner might be 3 or 4 pages, but we might just have 1 or 2 little minor things, right? So we need to be an intelligent practitioner, become our own teacher, which is what the Buddha asked us to do. Recognize our habit energies, our patterns of thinking, our patterns of behavior, and what waters them, what nourishes them, because it's not going to be the same for every person. And then also to recognize our skillful habit energies, because often when we talk about habit energies, we think they're only negative. But we also have skillful habit energies as well. Habit energies of understanding, habit energies of peace, habit energies of joy. So we recognize also what nurtures those. And we become a skillful gardener. We choose to nurture the qualities we want to see in ourselves and in the other person, and in our family, in our society, in our community. Let's enjoy the sound of the bell. If you read this discourse in its entirety, there's a phrase that's repeated over and over again. With no secret hate. It's repeated over and over again. And the Buddha actually in the sutra gives the story of a woman. Her name was Vedika, and she had a maid called Kali. Kali was a wonderful maid who made Vedika's life so much easier, was so diligent. Even before Vedika could even was thirsty, and before she could reach for a glass, Kali would give the glass to her mistress and so on. Kali took such good care of Vedika. And Vedika was known among Shravasti as a woman who was so kind, so loving, so generous. And this went on for a little while. And then Kali thought, it's true, everyone in the town considers my mistress Vedika as a kind and compassionate and loving person, but she's never been challenged. How about I challenge her a little bit? And so Kali decides the next morning to sleep in just a little bit. I think some of us might have felt like sleeping in on the first day of the retreat, right? So this was the kind of situation. Kali decided to sleep in, that she wouldn't get up before her mistress. She would let her mistress make the morning tea and so on. So the door of Kali's bedroom burst open, and Vedika said, "You lazy girl, why haven't you gotten up? You're making me do all the work." And then, so Kali said, "Oh, I just didn't feel like it today. I wasn't feeling it." In the ancient equivalent. "I wasn't feeling it today." And then Vedika said, "Get up now." And so Kali realized to herself, actually, my mistress, whenever a challenging circumstance arises, she has this anger. So then the story keeps going on, and it's quite a long story, but each day Kali was sleeping in a little bit longer or doing something else to touch that seed in her mistress, to the point where at the end of the story, the mistress pulled out the bolt of the door and banged Kali on the head with the bolt on the door. And then when Kali was walking in the market, people were saying, this is the maid of Vedika, the woman that we thought was so peaceful, so loving, so generous, so magnanimous. Now, it's important to note that in this story that the Buddha gives, there's no blame given to Kali for provoking her mistress. The Buddha doesn't say that was the wrong thing to do, although we would probably consider it to be, oh, it's maybe a little bit too much. But for me, the way I read this, the way I interpret this story, is it's an important reminder that our practice is not about avoidance. No mud, no lotus. We've heard it so many times that a lotus doesn't grow on the marble. Our practice is not about avoidance and not just being with people that we find agreeable. If we like silence, we just be in silence. If we like noise, we're just in noise, all these kind of things. And the moment something disagreeable happens, we can't handle it. But rather, as we said before, it's when we're touched, when something penetrates those well-formed defenses, and yeah, we have a moment where we think, wow, that's actually our greatest teacher in disguise. It's almost as if that we're invited into, when there's a difficulty, rather than seeing it as an obstacle to be overcome, we see it also kind of like as a fortunate thing. We've got this going for us as well. I've shared the story about how in 2010 I was at a gathering of Buddhist teachers, and there was a very amazing female teacher. She was quite aged at that time. She was quite short and she had a walking stick, and she was coming around to all of the young teachers offering blessings, kind of grandmotherly blessings. And when she came to me, she looked me in the eye. It was a very piercing gaze. And she said to me, "I wish you a long and painful life." Yeah, we think, oh, but that is actually probably the most wonderful blessing that anyone can receive, because if we have a long and a painful life, and in addition to that we have the opportunity and the capacity, the willingness to look into those uncomfortable, those difficult situations of body, of mind, of environment, that's the healing that we can bring to the world. That's the healing that we can bring to ourselves. It doesn't fall from reading sutras or from chanting and so on, but from having the courage to look into the things that we don't want to look into. To be able to look into those things, to come to understand how they've arisen. We've got this going for us too. And then the Buddha says, in this way, after sharing, you should devote yourself to cultivating the skillful qualities in you and in the other person. He says, in this way and in no other will you achieve growth, improvement, and maturity in this teaching and training. In this way and no other will you achieve growth, improvement, and maturity in this teaching and training. That's what a good teacher does, helps us to become mature in this teaching and training. It's not only a teaching, but it's also a training. Whenever we hear a teaching or we encounter a teaching, we need to ask ourselves, how can I put this into practice? I remember when I was a young novice, I was having a big difficulty, and at that time I was my teacher's attendant. And I'd seen many other monastics and also lay people coming to my teacher to share their difficulties. And many times my teacher would take his hand and pat them on the head and give them some very sweet and gentle advice. It was so wonderful. And I was having this big difficulty. And so I thought, I'll go and share with my teacher. And I knocked on the door, And Thầy said, "Who is there?" And I said, "It's me." And Thầy said, "They's busy now. Come back another time." And then a day or so later, I came back and I knocked on the door. And then Thầy let me in, and Thầy said, "What is it?" And I shared with Thầy my difficulty, which I thought was really big. And Thầy just sat there for a moment and looked out the window and took a sip of tea, and then turned to me and said, "Don't waste my time with questions you already know the answer to." I was so young and I was so angry with Thầy that I walked out of that the hut, and there was like a gravel pathway, and I was kicking the gravel on the pathway. And then when Thầy came to give the Dharma talk, for the next couple of Dharma talks, I gave looking with these kind of eyes. It's a little embarrassing to share. But it was only after a couple of weeks that I realized that what my teacher had given me in an unexpected form. He had invited me to trust my own insight of what I needed to do, and actually to do it. And he was right. I did want to find another way, kind of an easier way. I just didn't want to do what I had the insight to do. That is what a real teacher does. Not necessarily in that way, but will always bring us back to our own insight, our own wisdom. So it's a teaching and a training. A teaching and also something to put into practice. And then the Buddha goes on and says, in the same way, a practitioner might be the sweetest of the sweet, the calmest of the calm, as long as they don't encounter any disagreeable criticism or situation. But it's when they encounter what is disagreeable to them that you'll know whether they're really sweet, they're really even-tempered, or they're really calm. A practitioner is easy to teach if they make themselves agreeable only. A practitioner is not easy to teach if they make themselves agreeable only for the sake of the requisites, because when they don't get these things, they make themselves disagreeable. Using the requisites here is a reminder of our tendency to run after small comforts, small things. So the requisites here, in the monastic sense, are the 4 requisites. When we become monastics, we belong to you. It's not only a ceremony that takes place up here, but when we become a monastic, we take refuge in the fourfold community. And so we make the aspiration to practice sincerely and wholeheartedly, and to do our best to offer, if we have any insight at all, to offer that. And then we're supported in the 4 requisites by the lay community. Food, clothing, medicine, and shelter. Those things. And it's so easy to become attached to those things. But each of us, whether we're a monastic or not, can become quite particular about the supports, the physical supports in our life. And then the Buddha says there's 5 ways that people might criticize you. Their speech might be timely or untimely. Might be in the right time or at the wrong time. You know, if we're getting criticism, we like to receive it, kind of alone. There's nobody else to hear it. If there's other people there, we feel all ashamed and so on. So timely or untimely. It might be true or false. If something's false, we kind of want to react right away and say, no, it's not correct. We want to explain it all. It might be true, it might be false. It might be gentle or it might be harsh. Some people, if we're offering a reminder, they say, it would have been so much better if you would have said it in a gentle way. I would have been able to hear it if it was in a gentle way. It was too strong. Or other people say, it was too gentle. You should have really been strong. You should be strong. That's the only way that person will get it. These kind of things. It could be true or strong, gentle or harsh. or it could be beneficial or harmful. From a heart of love or from secret hate. So all of these things, all of these different ways that people might criticize us, whether in the manner or from their motivation, the Buddha basically says these things are not important. Their motivation, whether it's strong, whether it's gentle, whether it's timely, untimely, not important. What's important is how you respond to it. The Buddha says you should train like this, and we've heard this before. Our mind and heart will remain unaffected. We will blurt out no bad words. We will remain full of compassion with a heart of love and no secret hate. We will meditate spreading a heart of love to that person like the river Ganges. And with them as a basis, we will meditate spreading a heart full of love to everyone in the world. If you're like this, then you would be as unaffected as if a person decided to get rid of the earth and began digging everywhere to try to get rid of the earth. Such a person, even though they try as hard as they can, will never be able to get rid of the earth. And actually the Buddha goes on to give 4 or 5 different examples of something similar to this. But there's a key phrase here. With them as a basis. With the person or the situation that we want to close out of our heart. We use them as a basis to develop our loving kindness. Usually the way that we are invited to develop loving kindness, which is not only something that's wishy-washy, it's a powerful force. We're instructed to cultivate loving kindness to those that we love, and then neutral, and those that love us, and then neutral people, and then slowly, and it's almost as if we kind of just include that difficult person later on, sort of by accident. They're just there on the periphery, but we're surrounded by all those that love us and things. Actually, the Buddha here is saying using them as a lens, using them as a basis, through which to develop loving kindness to the whole world. This again is a reminder for us. And I think when we look at the situation of the world outside and the world inside, this invitation has never been more timely than now. There are so many situations in which we're divided into an us and a them, or there's a they, or even parts of ourselves as well. So to be able not only just to include that group of people or that part of ourselves, but to be able to use that as a basis for our spiritual life, to develop our loving kindness. This is a powerful thing. And the Buddha says you should frequently reflect on this advice and put it into practice. This will be for your lasting welfare and for your benefit, the benefit of many. So this is the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha's advice for us in the simile of the soul. And I think it's a very important teaching for us. I really recommend, as I've said twice before, that we take time to read and reflect on this teaching and consider how to put it into practice. To use that situation, that person, that group of people as a basis, especially as we come to the end of the year. Those people that we call the enemy, that situation in our heart that, wish I didn't have that. What does it have to teach us? How can we open our heart just a little bit more? And to help us do that, the Buddha recommended a couple of reflections that we should reflect on many times a day. This teaching is given in the Anguttara Nikaya, the numbered sayings. And for me, I love to reflect on these things. The first is, have I truly left home? We spoke about this earlier. Have I truly left home? So we reflect on what is my home? I don't mean just my physical, the place I live, but my habit energies and so on, the patterns of thinking, patterns of behavior. Have I truly left home? What is my home? Am I a little bit freer today? A little bit more free today than I was yesterday? And then the second reflection is, how am I spending my time? How am I spending my time? Many of us would say that we are a practitioner of Dharma. In this hall, we'd say a practitioner of Dharma. And that's a wonderful thing. But I wonder if we go through and we reflect on our experience of a day, at the end of the day, and we look with kind of clear eyes. Mindfulness has, as one of its nature, this quality of illumination. So we kind of illuminate our day. And we reflect on all the experiences that we've had that day. And we consider the amount of time we've spent practicing Dharma, and the amount of time we've spent practicing our resentment, cultivating our resentment, our anger, our misperceptions, our habit energies. When we do that, it can be quite humbling. I wonder whether with that kind of light we see ourselves as a practitioner of Dharma or a practitioner of samsara. Samsara is not something that's only occurring outside, but it's this carefully cultivated situation of repeated patterns of dissatisfaction. The hamster wheel, over and over again. Am I a practitioner of Dharma or a practitioner of samsara? How am I spending my time? What am I spending my time on? Have I truly left home? Am I a little bit more free, a little bit lighter than yesterday? The second reflection is, my life is connected with, and it's dependent on so many others. So this is, in some ways, quite easy for monastics to reflect on, because everything we have, the clothes that we wear, the food that we eat, and so on, it's very clearly given to us. It's thanks to your kindness that we have all of these things, our food, our clothing, our medicine, shelter, and so on. But also, if we're at home, if we're a householder, also on some surface level, every single condition that comes to us, it's come through the labor of so many. So many have labored for that. We had the touchings of the earth last night, and we were reflecting on all of the work that the land ancestors have done and other people have done to make life easy and possible for us. So in some ways we have this sense of entitlement. We've become used to seeing things in a transactional way. I have money, I buy this. That's the kind of thing. And this is an invitation to sink down a little bit more deeply and to consider all the different efforts that make this thing possible for me. When we're about to have lunch, we'll have walking meditation and then lunch. It didn't just magically appear on the table. The cooks have put a lot of work there, but also so have all the farmers. Nature itself, so many causes and conditions have come together to create that food. It's part of a whole system, and so are we. Systems of liberation and systems of exploitation. So this is an invitation to reflect on those as well, that we are actually part of systems, many different systems. We're not an isolated individual. And also we can see too, one thing that as I was reflecting on this a number of years ago, my life is connected with many others, and so is everybody else. I started to also feel how fragile life is as well, how precious life is. It can disappear and transition so easily. And the life of others too, it's such a fleeting and fragile thing. It's connected and dependent on so many different conditions. So on the one hand, that sense of fragility and preciousness but also there's a sense of joy that emerges as well. How precious this is. The next recollection is, have I truly transformed any of my habit energies? So it can be helpful to reflect on, what are my habit energies? My habit energies of joy and peace and liberation, what are they? And also, what are my well-worn entrenchments? What are the patterns of thinking that I have, patterns of behavior that I have? What do those patterns of behavior lead to? And if they don't lead to cultivating those kind of beautiful trees that I want to see in my garden, how can I transform them? Notice it doesn't say, how can I get rid of them? But how can I transform those habit energies? The literal translation is, my behavior, speech, and thoughts should be different from those that I had when I was at home. So again, it's this invitation to expand our envelope a little bit. In what ways have I refrained from harm and offered benefit to myself and others today? So in Buddhism, when we talk about ethics, tonight we're going to have an introduction to the 5 mindfulness trainings. Ethics is not about just about what we don't do. The other part of ethics, the other wing of the bird of ethics, is what we do. Refraining from harm. The Buddha said if we practice that, that's only 50%. But the other aspect of ethics is being of benefit to ourselves and others. So if we only see the first 50%, refrain from this, then our whole practice can become this practice of avoidance. Ethics is those twofold things, refraining from harm and performing acts of benefit. So how have I connected with those around me today, and how have I taken care of myself? The next question to reflect on in these reflections is, how is my connection to the Sangha or the community? Creating Sangha was the very first act of the Buddha after his awakening. He went out immediately to find elements of his community, and yet sometimes we feel as if I have my personal practice and then I go to Sangha. I wish that person wasn't in the Sangha. It would be really great if that person wasn't there. They're so annoying. They breathe heavily during the meditations. They never read that word correctly, and so on. It'd be great if they weren't there. The Sangha is, we don't practice in spite of the Sangha, but our Sangha is our place of refuge. So how's my connection? Our practice is not an individual matter. How's my connection to the Sangha? Is it becoming deeper, more life-giving every day? It's actually the literal translation from the Pali of this sentence, how's my connection to the Sangha or community? It literally says, I hope that after examination, my kind friends in the spiritual path will not be able to reproach me. So in some ways, it also is this invitation into seeing the Sangha as our teacher, to open ourselves up, to receive the guidance of the community. The next is, what are the things that I'm clinging to? Do I recognize that I'm going to be parted from them very soon? We have a tendency to create a self, an identity around so many different things. They're not only physical things. We can give away all of our physical belongings but still be clinging on very tightly. What this means here is to look and see those parts of ourselves that we're clinging onto. And often they're views, they're positions, perceptions. Do I recognize that all the things that I hold dear are constantly in a process of change, and I'm going to be separated from them soon? I had a tea bowl that was given to me in Woljongsa, a Korean monastery that I was practicing in, by a Korean monk who was a tea master, a practitioner of the Korean form of tea meditation. I love that chawan, that bowl so much. I enjoyed drinking tea out of it every morning. It was a beautiful form of this Korean crackle glaze, so lovely. One day I was rinsing the bowl, and I got the water and I was throwing the water out of the bowl like this. And as I released the water from the bowl, my hands also released the bowl, and the bowl was flowing through the air like this. I had this split moment of thinking, oh no, my bowl! But then I realized that it's already broken. It had already been broken from the moment that I had that bowl. That in fact the bowl was only in that form for a period of time, and that it was going to continue on. It wasn't going to disappear entirely. It wasn't going to be a bowl anymore. But it was going to perhaps sink down into the earth, and maybe in 100 years or so somebody will dig up and make some clay and make something else, from that. Or it might sink down into the soil and nourish some flowers. A friend sent me a song recently that I realize has a lot of insight in it. It says that we are going to die. We are going to decompose. We're going to turn into daffodils and dandelions. And the bees will come and drink the nectar of those dandelions and those daffodils, and they'll make honey that our grandchildren will put into their tea. We're all eating each other. It's a very good song. Has anybody heard it? Yeah, you heard it? It's a good one, right? Yeah. I'm the owner and the heir of my deeds, of body, speech, and mind. Deeds are my womb. I love this. Deeds are my womb, that which gives birth to me, my relative, and my actual place of refuge. So we reflect on how we've been interacting, what kind of behavior we've been engaged in, speech, thinking, and so on. And I will inherit the fruit of these things. As the days and nights fly by, what sort of person am I becoming? What sort of person am I becoming? So we reflect back on our habitual senses, the kind of false home. And sometimes we notice that some of those entrenchments have become very deep indeed. What sort of person am I becoming? In our tradition, we have a verse that we recite in the evenings. It's called the Gata of Impermanence. Another day is ending. My life is becoming shorter. There's probably less time in front of me than's gone before. So how will I spend my time? Is this situation, this resentment that I'm holding, this pain, really going to be so important in a year? I was recently looking at some things that I'd written in my journal about 10 years ago, and it's interesting because I wrote down, I'm so upset about this thing, or whatever it was, and I can't even remember what it was now that I was upset about, or that I thought I needed to be really, to try to change. I can't remember what I was so inspired about, or that I was so angry about 10 years ago. That's a good thing. Is this really so important? What kind of person am I becoming? Then am I able to be alone? Yesterday, Brother Lin Nam reminded us of the importance as practitioners to be able to be alone. Now this doesn't mean to go and separate ourselves off in a hut on the side of the mountain, but to be able to be single-minded, to be able to be focused on what we're doing and not carried away by the drama. And not also necessarily being the one creating drama, like all the time. So am I able to be alone and not lonely? In the sense of having a personal practice also. What's my personal practice? What things nourish me? Am I being carried away by this and that, the dramas of daily life? What is that place that calls me forth, that's my deepest aspiration? Then have I had any insights or attainments? Have I had any insights or attainments? When I'm looking at my habit energies, if we ask that question, have I had any insights or attainments, people tend to think in very broad and vague terms. But it means here, when looking at the root of my anger, looking at the root of my happiness, have I had any insights about that? Have I had any insights about why I'm suffering? Have I had any insights about what purpose that pattern of thinking, that pattern of behavior serves in my life? This is another powerful question. Have I had any insights? So these reflections are reflections that we can engage in each and every day, and they give shape to our practice. They help us to be able to see how we're doing in a very concrete way. Understand what we're practicing with, and help us to be able to move from that false sense of home into a greater sense of home. And for me, this is my invitation as we come to this period of New Year, to be able to take stock, to look back, and also as we go forward into the new year, to be able to move forward as practitioners moving on the path of spiritual maturity. I hope something has been helpful or useful for you this morning. Thank you so much. We'll enjoy the sound of the bell.